Hi everybody and welcome back. In this module, we're going to talk about interaction design. So what is interaction design? Well, let's talk a little bit about interaction design and illustrate a few of the dimensions of interaction design. What better way than to look at the Interaction Design Foundation's website and walk you through these 5 dimensions with an illustration. The first dimension, of course, is text, what we see, what that static representation is. The second is visual representation of those together. The third, physical object in space. The fourth is that time. And the fifth dimension is the behavior or the reaction. Let me break that down for you so I don't have to rush through it. Every interaction has these 5 dimensions. The first is words. What we can communicate quickly but robustly to the user that gives them that indication and significance of what they're about to encounter. The second dimension is those visual representations. Users first read the words, and secondly, they look for visual signifiers to give them context and provide additional information. Those visual signifiers can be in the form of images, typography, or icons. And with that, we layer in color. The third dimension of interaction design are the physical objects in space. For example, the user interacting with the experience on a specific product. If we can understand the context in the media form of the interaction, we can add some spatial components to it and make adjustments to the way that the interaction happens. The other element of interaction design is time. How much time is it taking them? How much of a delay is it between one choice and the next? How does a user measure their progress? Are there animations? Is there sound? Is there something that is tracking them? Is there a preloader? Is there a breadcrumb? Is there a countdown? Which brings us to the 5th dimension of interaction design, which is behavior, the user's reactions to the product. As they interact with your component, after they've understood the words and the visual significance, they've related to the context by which they're experiencing it, and then they've been subject to some specific point of time. The reaction to their interaction needs to be appropriate. Interaction design is concerned with anticipating user behavior and designing responses to that behavior. Can we predict what users are going to do to the point where we know exactly how to react to them? Well, in a lot of cases we can. A lot of the things that we're designing have been designed before, just not in the same context or in the same subject matter area. What we need to understand is what is happening out there now. What are the accepted conventions that exist? We address interaction design by developing conceptual models, user interface items built upon concepts. What people recognize in the real world could be a concept, an existing convention that we see. We also rely heavily on convention and metaphor, users' understanding of the meanings of patterns and symbols. And let me talk a little bit about that. Specifically about conventions, what we're talking about are things that people have experienced before, and especially the ones where they've experienced it on a repeatable basis. If someone has experienced a specific interaction before on a repeatable basis, and other users have had the same experiences, that becomes an accepted convention, a way that will remove the need for learning. Another element that removes the need for learning is metaphor. Metaphor we'll talk about in just a few more slides. First, let's talk about the conceptual model. A conceptual model defines the interface concepts users should understand in order to use the product or system. It also details the relationships between its concepts as well as possible operations. All that to say that if you have a feature or a function that you need to share with a user, you definitely need a component of interaction design to do that. And the concept by which you introduce that interaction is the model that we detail. That's called a conceptual model. Let me give you a practical example. If part of your experience needs to capture a user's login and password at some point throughout the interaction, you need to figure out the best way to capture that at the best point in the user journey, and then you need to display it in a way that encourages the 5 dimensions of interaction design. A presentation of words, some visual signifiers, the idea of presenting it in context, an element of time, and then of course a reaction to their action. That is a conceptual model. If you look at it and compartmentalize it in a specific interaction and include a specific feature or function that needs to be introduced, it becomes much easier to understand how you'll execute on it and how a conceptual model will work to drive the user forward in your conversion path. Let's not confuse conceptual models with mental models. Let me explain that a little further. A conceptual model is what the designer implements into the product or system to address a specific requirement. And they follow those dimensional attributes of interaction design, as we talked about. The mental model is the mental state of the user and what they expect the product or system to do. It's important to consider, of course, that mental model as we create the conceptual model, but it can't just be a one-to-one relationship in reverse. What we need to think about is that the mental models of multiple users have to be taken into account into one interaction. That's where the conceptual model takes a little bit longer to determine. In this example, the system interface is built to satisfy both the mental model and the conceptual model. It's designed by a designer, it's created by a designer to address exactly the expectations of our user. That, of course, is the goal. And if it can be done fluidly and address all of the interaction design components, then absolutely this is the best way to execute on. But the reality is that most conceptual models will differ a little bit from our mental models, or the mental models of every single user won't be met by the conceptual model we create for our interaction design. In this example, the expectation of a user in understanding how a home thermostat might work is potentially misinterpreted by their previous experiences. If a user approaches a home thermostat with a mental model of expecting it to work like their stovetop, they'll definitely get disappointed by the conceptual model introduced by the designer. The same thing applies if the user's expectation is that of a legacy thermostat or something even just a few years older than the current one and version that is viewed here. The user's expectation of the mental model of approaching changing temperature on one device versus the other is what we illustrate here. Increasing temperature and changing the heat parameters of their stovetop is an immediate action. Turn it to high, the flame is burning hotter. Whereas the thermostat You turn it to high, and there's a progressive increase. And the reaction is to indicate that the temperature is still currently at its existing temperature, but will eventually gain that. And there's no parity between these two experiences. By juxtaposing these two examples of temperature control, we need to approach them in a different way because of the mental model of the user. While conceptually, they're doing the same thing. Now that was an introduction to interaction design. We'll see you in the next module.